Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Lavalee, and today I will be presenting some highlights from the final report that I created for the Rural Communities Foundation through a partnership with the PhiLab Atlantic Hub. And the report is titled Thriving in a Time of Uncertainty, Grant Impact Report. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that this report is a collaboration between the Rural Communities Foundation of Nova Scotia and the PhiLab Atlantic Hub in February to April of 2022. And as much as this report was created by myself, it was very much a project that was made in collaboration with the grant recipients. So I would like to thank all of the grant recipients who were a part of this project and who took the time to share their stories with me. So I'll provide a little overview. First, I'll go through an introduction of the project, and then I'll go through my methodology, and then I'll quickly go through some of the findings that related to the interview questions themselves before I get into the 7 key themes that emerged from the interviews with grant recipients. And then finally, I'll end with a few recommendations for RCF moving forward. So I will properly introduce myself. My name is Sarah. I'm a senior undergraduate student in community development and environmental sustainability studies at Acadia University. And this project was initiated through a student work placement that all community development students have to do as part of their final degree requirements to graduate. And so I'd connected with the PhiLab to do my placement, and then they had connected me with the Rural Communities Foundation. And so the Rural Communities Foundation wanted someone to come in and do an assessment of the impact that their grants had. And so the project goal is really to assess the impact of RCF small grant programs on individuals involved and rural communities in Nova Scotia. And so defining impact in this project, it was defined as a change or capacity enabled in the group or the community at large because of access to RCF funding. And so what did I do? Well, essentially, I went through various lists of past and current grant recipients from various different funds offered through the RCF and came up with a short list of 11 past and current recipients with input from various board of directors through RCF. And in the end, I contacted these 11 shortlisted candidates, and 8 were able to have the availability to be interviewed. And then I invited them to share their stories with me through a 40 to 60 minute interview on Zoom. And so the selected recipients represented a range of RCF grants. There was one that represented the Joan Feynman Climate Action Fund, Gender Equality Fund, the Rural Vitality Grant Program, as well as the Soaring Eagle Fund and the Emergency Community Support Fund as well. And so, as I mentioned before, I'd emailed out to those 11 grant recipients and asked if they were able to do a 40 to 60 minute interview. And the 8 that had the availability agreed. And then I had to ask them a few questions. And so these questions really focused on 3 key areas. So I first asked them to define the project that was supported by the grant. Then I asked them to explain some of the sustainable impacts from the project on themselves and their community. And then finally, asked them a little bit about some of the challenges and strengths in their rural community. And so all these interviews were conducted from February 8th to March 25th of 2022. And so now I'll briefly go through each interview question and just go through a few of the highlights that came up throughout the various 8 recipient interviews that I conducted. So for the first, how did the project come to be? Many participants explained that they became involved in their projects through informal networks. They also identified personal experience as the inspiration for initiating a project, and then also that they had identified a gap or an opportunity where they felt that a certain support or program or resource was needed. And for the second question, what did you learn as recipients? It came up often that grant recipients felt that people needed to see it to believe it, particularly when it came to marginalized populations. They felt that many people did not have the role models that they felt they needed. And so it was really important to provide these opportunities. Secondly, it was necessary to find the right people to support the project. And then also, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was necessary to reimagine certain concepts. So even when meeting in person was no longer a reality, having to be creative and come up with creative solutions to still continue to provide these programs and services. And then for the next question, what issues did the project address? Many of the projects work to address racism and stigma for marginalized populations, including the 2S LGBTQ+ community, young people, Indigenous populations, as well as individuals dealing with substance abuse. Crisis intervention was another area where many of the projects aim to address, and also to address lack of place-based supports and services. And then for the question, has the project contributed to sustainable change? Many grant recipients expressed that either their project or the knock-on effects of their project had increased collaboration with other community organizations. And it also led to increased female representation in many cases, particularly in terms of local positions of leadership or governance. Many of the projects had also contributed to supporting the local economy, as well as increasing the community resilience overall, whether this was through increasing the social connections people had with each other, or improving the infrastructure, various ways to make a community, to increase the community's capacity to withstand external threats. Very much proven by the current pandemic that we're still in. And then when it came to challenges and strengths in our community, there was also quite a few recurring themes. So for challenges, gender-based violence continues to be a persisting issue, as well as the mindset of resisting change in rural communities, and an overall lack of resources. So that could be transportation, programs, services, healthcare, affordable housing, but a lack of resources was one of the key themes brought up many times as continuing to be a challenge in rural communities, as well as a large geographical regions that challenge service provision. And then also the false perception of quaint rural communities that can actually perpetuate issues by hiding or ignoring them because they don't fit into this perception. But on the other hand, there are many strengths to rural communities. One being the beautiful scenery. Many participants expressed just how lucky they felt and how much joy their environment brought them. Also the fact that rural communities tend to be quite tight-knit and that people support each other out of necessity, and often due to the fact that there are less resources available or less services, and so people have to rely on each other more and turn to their neighbors for those things. And then grant recipients also expressed that they felt that there was increased collaboration between organizations and individuals in rural communities because you tend to be closer to each other and have stronger networks, and also be closer to people in positions of governments and decision makers as well. And then for also the ability to take initiative was found to be facilitated in rural areas. It was expressed perhaps that there's less red tape than urban areas, and perhaps just a little bit more creativity that people have to be a little bit more creative out of necessity. And then the final question was, what are future plans for projects or ideas that came out of perhaps the current projects? So two recurring things came up often. The first was that many grant recipients expressed the desire to have more projects in the future to engage newcomers in their community, as well as hoping to develop more partnerships, particularly in the corporate sector. And this was especially to help address the continued issue of having a lack of sustainable funding. So now I'll move into the 7 key themes that emerged from all 8 interviews. So the first was the importance of place-based projects. And this was found to be important in terms of the issues that were addressed, the congruence of the project with local culture and values, And then also the ability of the project to honor local history. And I've just included a quote here from one of the participants. So we've had our journeys, our ups and downs, our challenges of turmoil, etc. But also it would not have gotten us to where we are right now in our lives if we hadn't gone through that. So to be aware of and honor how far we've come. And that was a participant who had worked on a project called the Women Strong documentary that was all about highlighting the stories of women of the present and also of the past on the South Shore. And so that ability to honor history that was so context specific was very important. It came up in many different projects. The second theme was the ability to utilize RCF funding to leverage more funding from other organizations. So whether this was from private donors, government, or other organizations, but this was found to be particularly important in three key areas. Firstly, that it helps address a lack of sustainable funding issue faced by many organizations. Second, that it allows organizations to provide free or subsidized programming. And thirdly, that it increases the collaboration between community organizations. So for example, the Digby Neck Collective had received the Community Vitality Grant a number of years ago, and through that grant had implemented a community-wide newsletter. And while the grant money no longer is there because it was from many years ago, but they have now continued to offer this newsletter and through the financial support of various local businesses and community groups. And so they've been able to build those connections within their community financially as well, but due to having the funding first from RCF. Then the third theme was the ability to amplify the work of other organizations. And this was achieved through three key areas. So through raising awareness, fundraising, and providing other resources such as human or equipment, etc. And in addition to amplifying the work of other organizations within the local community itself, it was also at varying scales. So for example, the Culture Link organization, they're looking, as the quote says here, trying to reach far and beyond our province and looking to connect with performing artists from all across the maritime provinces. And that was also a recurring theme among many of the grant recipient projects. Then the fourth theme was the ability to amplify marginalized voices due to the power of storytelling. This is particularly important as it gives agency to those with lived experience of the issues being addressed in their communities. Many grant recipients acknowledge that storytelling was a powerful tool to share knowledge and build connections, especially that knowledge transfer can sometimes be slower in rural communities, resulting in individuals who sometimes are operating with incomplete information. And as Courtney Connor explained from the McPhee Center in Dartmouth, we've had the opportunity to build a network and grow, and then that knowledge just gets stuck in the Halifax regional municipality and it doesn't get shared out. And that's, I think, ultimately the crux is build connection, share knowledge. And then another theme that emerged was that tradition and heritage in rural communities was thought of as a strength, but also as a barrier. So in terms of its strengths, trust and neighborliness is very strong in rural Nova Scotia and was found to really be woven into the very culture and fabric of rural communities, which led to a lack of a not in my backyard mindset. And many grant recipients expressed that they felt it was easier to ask for help in rural communities because that's just what you do in rural communities. It's part of the tradition, it's part of the culture. However, on the other hand, there was also the maintenance of traditional gender roles and perceptions of family that continues to persist in many rural areas, as well as having a resistant to change mindset. And then again, going back to that rural idol. So the idea that rural communities are all quaint, quiet, peaceful places, when in reality, they have issues like everywhere else in like urban areas as well, but that ignoring or hiding them because of people's tendency to try to adhere to this rural idol can actually further perpetuate them. And then another barrier that came up was the isolation from a lack of family connection. So many grant recipients expressed feeling that even though some of them had been there for many, many years, 15 or 20 years even, they still felt that they were not a part of the community in the same way as those who had historic connections in those communities. So I've included a quote here by Brenda Chisholm, who is the mayor of the town of Port Hawkesbury. She said, "One of the reasons why we really wanted to talk about leadership and celebrate women's leadership is oftentimes women have to see it before they believe it or be it, for themselves. And sometimes you have to do that for community members as well." So this quote goes back to the idea of that those traditional gender norms that are continued to be sometimes perpetuated in rural communities. And then the next one by Al McNutt, who is who is a part of the Many Hands Make Light Work organization in Truro. They provide harm reduction services. Says, "You don't know what's going on in the house next to you or 2 houses down from you. There's stuff going on in our neighborhoods, kids are using, and nobody knows they're hiding stuff." So this quote really speaks to that rural idol idea and the sometimes a false perception that rural communities are quaint and idyllic, which they certainly are in many ways, but that can also ignore or hide some really serious issues that need to be addressed as well. And then another theme was lack of resources in rural communities as a major barrier. So there were many lack of resources and types of lack of resources that came up. I've highlighted a few here. So a lack of equipment, lack of human resources, lack of transportation options that came up very, very often, and as well as a lack of funding, which can make the sustainability planning hard for organizations when they never know, when they're having to operate from grant to grant and never knowing exactly when they'll have funding or how much they'll have. So it makes it really hard to plan ahead, as well as a lack of childcare and other context-specific barriers. And so the quote here is just saying how important it is to provide youth with programming at their school so that they can easily access it, whereas having it in other areas, because of this lack of transportation, it makes it really challenging for youth to access extracurricular programming. And then finally, the 7th theme that emerged was that mutual aid model is a major strength in rural communities. Grant recipients expressed that there was increased volunteerism in their rural communities as opposed to urban areas. There's also this sense of coming together after tragedies that was really strong in rural communities. This was exemplified particularly through the recent mass shooting in Port-au-Prince, and the idea that rural communities are communities of care. And so I have a quote here. It says, "There's a commitment when things are tough in rural communities, people banding together, mutual aid. I don't think we call it that in rural communities. I think people just give people they love money or make them food or take care of them. But it is a mutual aid model. It is a community of care." And so once I'd gone through all these interviews and all these themes had emerged, in the end, I do have 3 kind of key recommendations for the ways that the Rural Communities Foundation could further support their current and future grant recipients. So firstly, by providing space and opportunity for knowledge sharing. It became very clear to me during the process that the grant recipients were very eager to share their stories, and they were very thankful to have the opportunity to share their stories. And in addition, even though all 8 grant recipients were working in various fields that were quite different from each other, there was a lot of overlap and a lot of recurring themes, even though they were working in such diverse spaces and fields and with diverse populations. So I think having those opportunities to bring diverse grant recipients together would be really beneficial to help share and troubleshoot common problems or challenges, and even share best practices, and just having the opportunity for the grant recipients themselves to share their own stories as well. And then secondly, that RCF could play a stronger role in facilitating the leveraging of funding. So going back to that theme that emerged, that many grant recipients had utilized the original funding they received from RCF to gain even more funding from bigger organizations or larger amounts of funding. Perhaps this could be a way, it seems to be kind of a niche area that RCF is fulfilling, and that maybe in the creation of future grants, they can be created in areas where there are already pre-existing larger funding available that maybe some smaller organizations wouldn't be able to access if not for the funding available through RCF. And then finally, to implement a simple and time-conscious assessment method for grant recipients to share the impacts of their grant. And so again, going back to the finding that grant recipients were just really thankful to have the opportunity to share their stories, perhaps providing a method for grant recipients in a simple and time-conscious way to share their story. So for every grant recipient can have that opportunity, because I know going through a whole process like this is not sustainable for every single grant recipient, but I do think it's an important part of the process. And I know that currently grant recipients are required to create a report, but even perhaps less formal ways would be beneficial. So maybe they could record themselves through a video, or also maybe could be a social media platform. So there's various ways this could occur, but it did seem very clear to me how much people wanted to share their stories, and how that really seemed to have an impact on them as well. So thank you very much for listening, and for more information, you can visit the website to learn about the various grants, etc. But yeah, thank you so much.